we are. If anyone is on there, and if anyone's watching and can comment on my sound level, I just need to be sure I got the sound right. Whoa, shoot. Technical difficulty there. Now where am I? There I am. Okay, I got multiple screens open here, or windows open here, so sorry. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. This is a new style that I want to try for my videos in the future. Instead of just doing one video scripted ahead of time, I film it, shoot it, cut it like every other YouTuber. I'm thinking about maybe live streaming my videos, and then if I feel like it, cutting them together later. If I feel like it, but not sure about that. It's just a new format I've been wanting to try because it's very time consuming, the scripting, the research, and all that. So I thought I'd try this, maybe cut out some of the steps of the process altogether, see if that go a bit easier. Talking about the platform of the Socialist Party of America. So that's one of the most interesting documents in the history of American socialism. Probably take some ideas from this platform and even learn some things from the policies it proposes. So today I want to talk about and see what policy we can take based on the ones here, and also just take a chance to look into a really fascinating point in history. In the 1800s, the Socialist Party of America was one of the was at its peak in the 1912 election. They got about 6% of the vote, running Eugene Debs as their candidate, who is probably my biggest hero, I'll be honest. They never got to the same that the Socialists had before them, but they did grow quite significantly, and they were fairly successful. They were especially large in the Midwest and in surprisingly that I found very surprising and over the course of my research. I'm actually doing some actual research on this topic for a report. And they were even strong here in Kansas. Well, actually, I'm saying in Missouri right now, but beside the point. So the 1912 platform was really an interesting point because you get a bit of the struggles that were going on, a bit of the context of the issues they were facing at the time. And so we'll be discussing some of that. But the opening part really gives you an idea of what the issues they were seeing. Did I just get some feedback or something? That sounded weird. The issues that they were facing at the time. It opens with an announcement. I'm only going to read part of the intro. It is pretty long. Issues, but if you want to read the rest of it, I have a link in the description where you can read the whole platform, and I highly encourage that you go through and read the whole thing. So let's get into it. The Socialist Party declares that the capitalist system has outgrown its historical function and has become utterly incapable of meeting the problems now confronting society. We denounce this outgrown system as incompetent and corrupt, and the source of unspeakable misery and suffering to the whole of the working class. Under this system, the industrial equipment of the nation has passed into the absolute control of a plutocracy which extracts an annual tribute of hundreds of millions of dollars from the producers. Unafraid of any organized resistance, it stretches out its greedy hands over the resources of the nation, the land, the mines, the forests, the state, and the union. In spite of the multiplication of labor-saving devices and improved methods in industry, which cheapen the cost of production, the share of the producers has grown ever less, and the prices of the necessities of life increase steadily. The boasted prosperity of this nation is for the owning class alone. To the rest, it means only greater hardship and misery. The high cost of living is felt in every home. Millions of wage workers have seen the purchasing power of their wages decrease until life has become a desperate battle for mere existence. Sound familiar? Multitudes of unemployed walk the streets of our cities or trudge from state to state, awaiting the will of the masters to move the wheels of industry. The farmers in every state are plundered by increasing prices extracted for tools and machinery, by extortionate rents, freight rates, and storage charges. Capitalist concentration is mercilessly crushing the class of small businessmen and driving its members into the ranks of propertyless wage workers. The overwhelming majority of the people of America are being forced under the yoke of bondage by this soulless industrial despotism. It is this capitalist system that is responsible for the increasing burden of armaments, the poverty, the slums, child labor, most of the insanity, crime, and prostitution, and much of the disease that afflicts mankind. Under this system, the working class is exposed to poisonous conditions, to frightful and needless perils to life and limb, and is walled around with court decisions, injunctions, and unjust laws, and is preyed upon incessantly before the benefit of the controlling oligarchy of wealth. Under it also the children of the working class are doomed to ignorance, drudging toil, and darkened lives. Sorry, technical issues here, sorry. As all thoughtful observers are appalled at them, the legislative representatives of the Republican and Democratic parties remain faithful servants of the oppressors. Now, the introduction goes on explaining the failures of the parties and progressive reforms of adequately address the issues of capital they were facing. And it then also explains the nature of class conflict and some other things. I have linked the full text of the platform in the description, but I just want to highlight this first part because I really think it's relevant today. While I don't think the situation we are in today is the same as it was back during the late end of the Gilded Age, start of the Progressive Era, history does have a tendency to rhyme and echo, and I think a lot of what it says still holds true today. While the conditions and living standards have definitely improved, that the platform bemoans has gotten worse, and many of the claims about capitalist consolidation and the gap between productivity and wages is very true, and actually probably more true today than it was back then, especially with the rise of automation. Do I need to catch my breath there? Platform that propose and these are described not as things that will establish socialism right away, but they are measures calculated to strengthen the working class in its fight for the realization of its ultimate aim, the cooperative commonwealth, and to increase its power against capitalist oppression. This is very important. It makes it clear these policies are not going to bring about socialism in and of itself, but they are meant to bring about what they refer to as the cooperative commonwealth. And this was a reference to a book that was very popular at the time among socialists. I forget the name of the author, Gronlund, I want to say, which really helped popularize a lot of Marx's ideas, but took a different angle on them. And the idea of the cooperative commonwealth is probably what we would today call just a socialist democracy or a democratic socialist economic system. But it's a term I really think we should bring back, actually. But this point that it's making is that these policies are not to increase socialism. Policies aren't necessarily just what socialism looks like. They are going to pave the way for socialism, and this is made even clearer at the very end, which says such measures of relief as we may be able to force from capitalism are but a preparation of the workers to seize the whole powers of government in order that they may thereby lay hold of the whole system of socialized industry and thus come to their rightful inheritance. This is a key point I think we really need to remember. When we do running campaigns, the point is not to just say, oh, in our platform, hey, we're replacing capitalism. That's point one in our platform. No, it paved the way for a transition to socialism, or as they say in this platform, and build the foundations upon which socialism can be built. The goal is to build worker power, and that's what these policies are designed to do. So I think that's something we really need to keep in mind and remember as we campaign and as we fight for various reforms, like, say, single payer. The goal is not, this is what socialism is going to look like. It's going to look like single payer. Single payer is but a means to an end, and that end is to build worker power and eventually socialism. So the working program separates itself into 4 sections. And before I go into any policies, I'm going to say some of these policies have since been enacted and are not really worth discussing. So I'm going to skip around. If I skip a policy, I may mention it, but it's because it's obsolete or relevant to the present day. The first section is titled Collective Ownership, and this one took me a little bit to understand what it meant, because the term collective ownership, but it's pretty clear to me, because that makes the most sense on what they're talking about in these things, at least public ownership and democratic controls, which they will get into. So the first point, the collective ownership and democratic management of railroads, wire and wireless telegraphs and telephones, express service, steamboat lines, and all other social means of transportation and communication large-scale industries. Please do keep in mind this platform was written in 1912, and some of these policies are, well, antiquated, to put it simply. Telegraphs at that time were a key part of their communication infrastructure, and steamboat lines were still a major part of transportation infrastructure, although rail was rapidly surpassing it. Now, I'm pretty sure we no longer have steamboat lines at all, because that technology has been obsolete for, a century. And I don't even know if even the telegraph lines exist, because I know that we don't use it that much, if at all, anymore. So it would surprise the hell out of me if we still had the lines. But I think that the point that it's making about the public ownership of the nation's communication and transportation infrastructure is just as important today as it was back then. This means that a policy we will need to be promoting calls for the nationalization of railways, highways, ISPs, and wireless networks. And I've been writing this script for several months, but as I did this, I actually found out that there has been some consideration over nationalizing 5G wireless networks in the US right now out of national security concerns. So that was kind of an interesting and very helpful little factoid. Hold up. Number 2, the immediate acquirement by the municipalities, the states, or of all grain elevators, stockyards, storage warehouses, and other distributing agencies in order to reduce the present extortionate costs of living. I was a little confused by this one when I first read it, because I'm from the suburbs. I don't know that much about agriculture. I actually had to ask my mom what grain elevators were, so that's kind of sad. So all that much about this topic, but from what I've learned, these are just basic, facilities and things used in agriculture. And I don't know much about the present state of it, but I would say that local control, i.e. municipal or state control of these various assets, would be a very good idea if that is still the case that's necessary. I think they'd be better managed in local hands than in national hands, just given the massive size of the agricultural industry in the country. We really do need to take a good look at agricultural policy, the issues of farmers directly, because that's something we often forget, I think, in the socialist movement. Because a lot of and so we often forget about the concern. I think. I disagree with that. Please let me know in the comments if you do. Moving on. Number 3, the extent of the public domain to include mines, quarries, oil wells, forests, and water power is pretty sufficient in of itself. But add to this also pipelines, solar, wind, geothermal, and nuclear power infrastructure as well. Nationalize all of those or municipalize them if that makes more sense, because we should have the whole of the power grid should be in our hands as well. So, moving on. 4, the further conservation and development of natural resources, and there's an addition. But as I did all of it, I thought it was. That was just part of it. Sorry. Now, I feel that some of this point goes without saying. I think this plan refers to the national park system, which was heavily expanded during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, which was only several years before. Roosevelt was actually running, again, in this election on the progressive ticket, if people know their history that well. And I personally think that we do need to be very defensive of the national parks as socialists. We should be defending them. Attempts by this administration to open them to oil drilling and other ridiculous policies like that, and proposals to privatize them, should be vigorously opposing those. Number 5, The collective ownership of land wherever practical, and in cases where such ownership is impractical, the appropriation by taxation of the annual rent value of all the land held for speculation and exploitation. This is pretty clearly just talking about land reform here, but I don't know how necessary that is in the 21st century. Again, I know nothing about agricultural economics, so I don't know if that is something if land reform is something we really need to be talking about that much. Land in the U.S. was a very different thing from in many European nations, where land reform was, a necessity. Here in the U.S., there was just so much of it, and so much of it was arable that it was not quite the same situation as it was in Europe. So, now moving on. 6. The collective ownership and democratic management of the banking and currency systems. Nationalize the banks, have them democratically managed, and make sure that the federal system, even, although I've heard pretty good arguments against that. I've heard arguments on both sides there. But we need more democratic accountability over the monetary system, and we desperately need the public ownership of the banks. That is something we absolutely have to demand, and we need to make them democratically managed by everyone who holds an account in them. Goal, one policy proposal, and states simply, the immediate government relief of the unemployed by the extension of all useful public works. All persons employed on such works should be engaged directly by the government under a workday of not more than 8 hours and not less than wages. The government also to establish employment bureaus without interest for the purpose of carrying on public works, and to take such other measures within its power as will lessen the widespread misery of the workers caused by the misrule of the capitalist class. A good chunk of this is what was effectively done 20 years later by FDR during the New Deal, and many left-wingers have been proposing this in pretty much every left reform ever since 1912. At all costs, and a government employment bureau. A WPA-style bureau is something we should have full-time. And also, this idea is, I also do like one idea they do have in here, and that's lending money to states and municipalities without works. That's actually a really good idea. We don't really do that all that much. Most federal money is just done directly. This would allow the federal government to effectively give money directly to state agencies as a loan. But I really like this. Cover budget shortfalls and whatnot. In Kansas, we really could have used this with education recently. So what's this is what are called industrial demands, and these are policies concerning workers' rights and the conditions of the working class. Now, this section has a lot in it, and I'm going to be skipping a few. Are now policy, but overall it calls for the conservation of life and well-being of the workers. It says do this by 1, by shortening the workday in keeping with the increased productiveness of machinery. Or it was back in 1912 because of automation. This was a 40-hour work week. Today, we could cut out an entire workday of the week or more thanks to the increases in productivity that we've seen as a result of computers and automation. France reduced their work week to 35 hours in 2000, and right now, IG Metall, I probably butchered that, I'm sorry, but that's Germany's largest trade union, is calling for the work week to be shortened even more, from 35 hours to 28 hours. Just bumped my mic there. Limiting us back to the 40-hour work week and increasing wages, we should also be pushing towards a 28-hour work week, and I'd say start by pushing for a law to institute a 35-hour work week. We absolutely should cut a full hour off of the workday. Why are we not talking more about this one in a lot of our policies? Cutting the workday in half is absolutely necessary. Number 2, by securing for every worker a rest period of not less than a day and a half in each work week. Now, we already have the weekend now, thanks in large part to unions and also Jewish groups. But in the modern day, the struggle for guaranteed not have paid parental leave or vacation time. And so we need to be continuing to fight for this medical parental and time that they need. Now I'm going to skip over the next few points. Point 3 has to do with the inspections of factories, workshops, and mines. We have agencies like OSHA today that handle that. They can always be improved, of course, but they didn't really exist back then. Points 5 and 6 have to do with child labor, and point 8 has to do with establishing a minimum wage. We already have that, and we have that now. It should be increased. I've been advocating for that for years, but frankly, we have it now. And number 9 calls for a system of pensions, which we now have through Social Security. Again, something that can be expanded and improved, but we have it now. So, proposal number 4. This is concerns, but I think there's a proposal here that we should at least the cooperative organization of the industries in federal penitentiaries for the benefits of convicts and their dependents. Think about that for a sec. That would mean that the industries within prison, all prison organized cooperatively, would manage their own workdays there and distribute and have the authority to distribute the gains of their labor in accordance with their needs. That's something that we should really look at. And with the recent prison strike, we absolutely need to be doing this. I know a lot of American socialists favor prison abolition, including DSA, but I'm not all that educated on the subject or the alternatives to prisons. But I think the proposal here is quite interesting and worth further examination. So if anyone out there is more educated on this topic, please leave a comment below on your thoughts on this idea. 7. By abolishing the profit and subsidies, either substituting the direct or the contracts to cooperative groups of workers. What this would mean is no more federal contracts with private corporations, and instead we would just hire workers to do public works directly by the government. This actually is something we should really look into. If any of you are familiar with the F-35 program, that massively went over of the driving force in its development, not necessarily the military. And I know this is a bad example, because I would want to cut military spending quite significantly, but that just is one example of how this has happened. Also, with the healthcare enrollment website back in, I believe it was 2013, there was a contractor that did that, and we all know how that worked out. Ending contracts to for-profit corporations has some clear and obvious benefits, and it would also really help them get up and on their feet, become a larger, important part of the American economy by preferring for hiring for federal contracts, I mean. I'm interested, but don't really do much. Number 2 calls for the creation of a progressive income tax and a graduated estate tax, which we now have. Of course, we should definitely increase taxes for the rich, but we have the basic system. And number 14 calls for the creation of a Department of Labor, which they didn't have at that time, but we have now, so I'm just going to skip it. So I'm going to start with number 3. Number 3, the abolition of the monopoly ownership of patents and substitution of the collective ownership with direct rewards to the investors by premiums and royalties. Okay, I know next to nothing about patent law or, for that matter, copyright law. What I believe this would mean is that it would effectively abolish the right of a single company to patent a product and then exercise a monopoly over the production, sale, and use of that given technology. and instead they would be publicly owned and royalties would be paid directly to the inventor. Honest, I know about law in the early 20th century, but I think we should really be discussing the reforms to the patent law. I know there are some people that are far more educated about this than I, and so we need to be discussing how we can change patenting and copyright law, especially and making those publicly available, again, has clearly available for the public. They should not this are, and frankly, I do not understand why like it that a lot of people's copyrights last way longer than the copyright that you want to go to. But let's move on. Number 4, unrestricted and equal suffrage for men and women. Now, the 19th Amendment was passed 8 years after the 1912 election. So in context, this is pretty clearly about women's suffrage. But I want to bring it up because, as we already are, but I want to make this point again, we need to defend voting rights from people like Kansas Secretary of State and gubernatorial candidate Chris Kobach. Go back and watch my video on him. And also fight for the right to vote for all prisoners and convicted felons. P.S. Anyone watching this video, please go vote to stop Chris Kobach from becoming governor in Kansas, and to people in Florida, Amendment 4. Number 5, initiative, referendum, and recall, and nationally. Many states have adopted the initiative and referendum systems, and most states now have a recall process for elected officials. However, some states don't have parts of this. Kansas does not have an initiative process, and there's no national referendum system. So establishing a national referendum system and expanding the initiative system should be goals for the left nationwide. In Kansas, that should be one of our top 3 priorities, I think, is establishing a local initiative system. And, if we had national referendums, that would actually make certain things like amending the Constitution far easier, and I'm actually going to discuss that one later on in this video. As for proportional representation, I'm a huge advocate for that. I think we should have a proportional representation system, but I think we should I'm going to make a separate video about that because there are a couple different models I want to discuss on it, so I'll come back to that one in a later video, and I'm relying on you guys to hold me accountable for that. Number 6, the abolition moment. Rather current presidential one, I think it's good to have some limits on power as long as we have the presidential system and maintain the balance of powers as much as we can. And I think it's good that in a federal system to have a Senate to represent the states which have less congressional representation because there are local issues that need to be protected. That being said, I think the Senate in its present form has way too, and it's and the same goes for the president, the powers over executive orders. So I'm not in favor of abolition of the Senate or of the veto, but I do think we should just now reforming the political system to weed out corruption and abuses of power. 7, the election of the president and vice president by a direct vote of the people. I made a video on this subject back in 2016, so just go back and watch that one. It's one of my videos I did a long time ago. Made it right after the election. Please watch it. That's all I'm going to say there, because the Electoral College is dumb. I'm sorry, it is. The abolition of the Supreme Court to pass upon the constitutionality of the legislation enacted by Congress. National laws to be repealed only by act of Congress or by a referendum. a lot. He gave that power to himself in the Marbury v. Madison ruling in 1803. Or a constitutional amendment to limit the Supreme Court's powers. Now, is that a good idea? I'm kind of on the fence about this one. Historically, the Supreme Court has definitely ruled a lot more in the interests of the ruling class and has ruled in support of reactionary policies. We saw this historically with Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson, but more recently, we've also seen this, the Supreme Court do this with Janus v. AFSCME back over the summer, Citizens United back in 2010, and Bush v. Gore back in 2000. So there was a 30-year period where the court did do some good with, Brown v. Board of Education, the whole Warren Court era, pretty much. They did some genuine good there. So I'm personally torn on the idea, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. We definitely should be limiting the power of the Supreme Court as well. But completely abolishing the power of judicial review is something that I'm torn on. So the establish restrictions upon the amendment of the Constitution so that instrument may be I need to get another drink of water here. It's a majority of the state legislatures to pass an amendment, and this is incredibly burdensome. We're the hardest constitution in the world to amend, and the fact that it's so difficult to amend has pretty much made the Supreme Court more powerful, because the easier route for resolving constitutional issues is just having the Supreme Court rule on it. So we absolutely need to be discussing this in the context of constitutional reform. We need to say, hey, we got to reform the Constitution. We got to make it easier to amend. A majority of voters in a majority of states seems to make the most sense to me. You get both of or more of the voters in each state in a majority of the states nationwide. To amend it, that would be a majority of the people. I would hope, at least. So you couldn't just have that. Would make it so a majority balance in preventing the smaller states from being overrepresented, I would think, at least, although I'm not a math expert. Pardon me. Points in one at once. Back during this time, government, that didn't happen until 1973 with the District of Columbia Home Rule Act. And they also had 8 presidential elections until the 20, which was passed in 1960. Now, while they do have home rule now, Congress still has the power to overturn any local law passed by the local government in D.C. And they have no representatives in Congress or senators, no voting representatives. They do have delegates, but they don't have voting members. So admitted to the U.S. as the 51st state, or we should our state on their own. Frankly, we should. They need to have the full powers of everywhere else in the country. The fact that we don't have that right now is utterly despicable. And the fact that we don't have it is pretty partisan. The Republicans don't want to give it to them because they don't want 2 new Democratic senators or a voting Democratic member of the House in there, which, again, super messed up. Now, As for number 11, this was right during the era when the U.S. started to get more involved globally. American Alaska, Puerto Rico, Guam, and a few others had just been created as U.S. As they effectively had military, did local governments, but as we've seen in the U.S. state for NATO, that so we'll see what happens. What happens here? Moving on to 12. The enactment of further measures for the conservation of health, the creation of an independent Bureau of Health with such restrictions as will secure full liberty to all schools of practice. Pardon me. Speaking of health, obviously public sanitation has greatly improved since the 20th century. We no longer have trash, just like mountains of trash. Look at some of the pictures that back we no longer have open sewers better than it was back then. But there is a huge thing we can still do, and that's enact single-payer Medicare for all health care for every man, woman, and child in America. We are fighting for that right now. We need to continue to fight for it. That needs to be a focus. I'm glad that we are doing so. The Bureau of Health to discuss, that's in existence now. It's the DHS, or DHHS, not DHS. Definitely no, get rid of the DHS, but HHS is what I meant. 13, the enactment of further measures for the general education and particularly for vocational education in useful pursuits. The Bureau of Education to be made a department. Now, the department part, that's done. But making all public, that is essential demand. And the defense of public schools. Absolutely. In Kansas, that is a very serious issue that we're facing all the time. The Republicans basically the school, they get away with it. So fight for public school. 15. The abolition of all federal district courts and the United States Circuit Court of Appeals, state courts to have jurisdiction in all cases arising between citizens of several states and foreign corporations. The election of all judges for short terms. This is an interesting proposal, but I'm not sure it's the right way to fix the corruption and lack of transparency in the justice system. I am court systems, so I can't really say from any socialist legal experts out to let me know if such a thing exists. Now, because of my lack of understanding, I'm also going to skip number 16, which calls for curbing the power of the courts to issue injunctions, and number 17, which calls for the free administration of the law, which I'm not quite sure what that even means. If you want to comment on either of these, please do so in the comment section below, because I really don't know what that means at all. So moving on to the last point in the platform. Yes, we finally got here. It took us 32 minutes, but 18, the calling of a convention for the revision. We massively change the Constitution. As talked about in here, we discussed that would require constitutional changes, creating a reform. One, amending the way that we need to amend as well. Getting money out of politics, like that's a actually, it surprised a lot of people to know, but Bush v. Gore, they ruled there is no right to vote in the Constitution. Uh, so we need to start having a serious conversation about calling a constitutional convention to pretty much rewrite huge sections of it. There is a corporate interest that are trying to push for an Article 5 convention right now with the goal of gay, and so we need to push back on that. But the goal should not be to defend the Constitution as it is now. Their envisioned constitutional convention with a vision of a constitutional convention of our own. So, personally say we should be discussing a constitutional convention, or at least talk about passing an amendment to make it the Constitution. That should be number one, frankly. So, history of American socialism. I really wanted, this was kind of a passion project for me that I just really, really wanted to do, something I've been really wanting to do a long time. Thanks so much for bearing with me as I descend into. What are your thoughts? Do you think that that we should be adopting all of these sections into our platform unchanged, or are there parts that you absolutely disagree with, like the stuff about the courts that I don't really understand? What did I get wrong in this video? What do you think? Please let me know in the comments below. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. I'm going to try this new format. Tell me what you think. I'm not sure what I think right now, but have a great evening. Oh, sorry. I'm tired.